Euaoi.
Animation. It's a medium that has existed in many forms throughout its history. From the earliest forms of animation in the style of shadow puppets to the phenakistoscope, the zoetrope, the flipbook, and the proxenoscope in the 19th century. It always felt like whenever humanity reached a new breakthrough in technology, a new breakthrough in animation would soon follow. This is especially true due to the breakthrough of cinematography at the turn of the 20th century, where we've seen new styles of animation be created in ways that weren't possible before, with early examples including 1907's The Haunted Hotel, which utilized stop motion and helped bring what were once inanimate objects to life, and 1908's Phantasmagory, which is considered by many film historians to be the world's first hand-drawn animated cartoon. In the 1910s, animated cartoons became a massive industry in the United States, so much so that producer John Randolph Bray and animator Earl Hurd patented the cell animation process, which ended up being the process that dominated 20th century animation. This animated cartoon industry evolved in the form of creating memorable cartoon characters such as Felix the Cat, who was considered to be the world's first fully recognizable animal character in animation. In the late 1920s, animators found out how to synchronize sound with animation with the 1928 film Steamboat Willie, popularizing the medium and helped spark what is generally referred to as the golden age of American animation. This was mainly due to the fact that we also ended up getting a lot of popular cartoon characters from this period that are still well known to this day, such as Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, Goofy, Porky Pig, Daffy Duck, Bugs Bunny, Betty Boop, Popeye, Tom and Jerry, Woody Woodpecker, and many others. Not to mention that the animated shorts these characters starred in are considered by many animation professionals to be some of the greatest cartoons ever made to this very day. Animated cartoons evolved even more in the 1930s when cartoons were animated in color rather than just black and white, along with the creation of feature-length animated films such as Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Pinocchio, and Dumbo. The golden age of American animation ended at around the 1960s, and the cause for this was that animated theatrical shorts started to lose popularity among the public in favor of television. And when television sets became popular in the US, the medium of animation ended up moving there as well, which is why in this video I'm going to be showcasing the history of American television animation and how it has changed with each decade, based on the styles and the kinds of shows that were airing during those times. Without further ado, let's dive right into it. When television became common in American households, the biggest problem animators face when bringing animation to television is that television generally had a much lower budget compared to that of cinema. Disney's solution was to have the shows mostly be in live action with little bits of theater quality animation sprinkled in there, with examples of this being the Mickey Mouse Club and Disney's various anthology shows. There were also some shows like Gumby that utilized cheaper methods of animation like stop motion instead of cell animation. The solution that most animation studios went with is something that's called limited animation, where many frames were reused multiple times for budget cutting and time-saving measures. Because of this, the characters themselves didn't have much movement to them and at times only felt like their heads were moving while their bodies remained frozen. Because of this, early television animation is generally considered among animation historians to be the Silver Age of American animation. As for the types of shows that aired during this time, most of them followed the same format as their theatrical counterparts, as the episodes themselves were short in length, with runtimes typically averaging 4 to 7 minutes and showcased wacky hijinks. The first major animation studio to focus exclusively on television was Hanna-Barbera, and it was the one that ended up dominating television animation throughout this period. This was mainly due to the success of the Huckleberry Hound show, where the format of the show featured 3 short segments, with the first one always starring Huckleberry Hound, and the rest starring other characters. Other segments included Pixie and Dixie and Mr. Jinx, which was basically Tom and Jerry but put more of an emphasis on verbal humor to compensate for the limited animation. And Hokey Wolf, which featured the eponymous wolf and his small companion, Dingaling Wolf, acting in their typical con artist ways. The segment that became massively popular among viewers was Yogi Bear, which featured the character typically accompanied with his friend Boo Boo, going about their days stealing picnic baskets while trying to evade Ranger Smith. Because of Yogi's popularity, he ended up getting his own spin-off series that also followed the Huckleberry Hound format not long after. The Huckleberry Hound format ended up being used for other shows like Jay Ward's Rocky and Bullwinkle show and Hanna-Barbera's own Quick Draw McGraw show. I should also mention that a lot of these cartoons were sponsored by cereal manufacturers like Kellogg's in an attempt to reach consumers of a wider audience, particularly children. When the 1960s came along, we started to see television animation diversify and take new forms to further differentiate itself from theatrical animation. Aside from shows in this decade that followed the Huckleberry Hound format, such as Peter Potamus and his magic flying balloon, as well as adding on the fact that some cartoon characters who originally made it big in theaters like Felix the Cat and Popeye also happened to get TV adaptations at around this time. Cartoons being sponsored by cereal companies still continues to be a thing here. In fact, one of those shows, Linus the Lion-Hearted, had characters from various segments who were all mascots for various post-cereal brands. Linus sponsored the short-lived cereal Crispy Critters, Sugar Bear sponsored Sugar Crisp, and Rory Raccoon sponsored Post Toasties or Corn Flakes, among many others. Going back on topic, one way that television animation diversified itself more from theatrical animation was the creation of primetime television shows from Hanna-Barbera, such as The Flintstones, The Jetsons, Jonny Quest, and Top Cat. We've also had primetime animated shows that weren't made by Hanna-Barbera, like The Alvin Show, Calvin and the Colonel, and The Famous Adventures of Mr. Magoo. What made these shows different from shows like the Huckleberry Hound show is that each episode is in the style of a traditional sitcom, rather than having each episode be split into short segments, or in Jonny Quest's case, an action-adventure cartoon. There were even some shows like Wacky Races that had their episodes be divided into two 11-minute segments, a format that became popular with a lot of cartoon shows in the future. The 1960s also introduced television adaptations of Charles Schulz's popular comic strip, The Peanuts, starting with the premiere of the classic special, A Charlie Brown Christmas, in 1965, with many more primetime specials airing within the following decades. The 1960s also brought along the Saturday morning cartoon, though it was originally used for telecasts of theatrical shorts like the ones from Looney Tunes. But later in the decade, Saturday morning cartoons mainly consisted of animated television adaptations of superheroes like Superman, Batman, and Aquaman, which were produced by Filmation, a new television animation studio that emerged during this decade. Hanna-Barbera also hopped on the superhero cartoon trend with shows like Space Ghost, Birdman, and an animated adaptation of Fantastic Four. But this trend ended up being short-lived as these cartoons were criticized by parents for their violence. One Saturday morning cartoon that made a monumental impact on the genre was Hanna-Barbera's Scooby-Doo, Where Are You?, which not only created one of the most successful animated franchises around, but also helped shape the landscape of 1970s television animation. The 1970s started a new era of animation, one that critics and animation historians refer to as the Bronze Age or the Dark Age of American animation, which lasted until the end of the 80s. The reason why animation historians consider this time to be the Dark Age is due to the perceived cheap production values, poor animation, and mixed critical and commercial reception, not to mention the growing stigma of cartoons being mainly for kids that occurred around this time. I should also mention that the term Dark Age is heavily subjective, as there are a good amount of Gen Xers who watched these Saturday morning cartoons as kids and remember these shows fondly. Following the success of Scooby-Doo, Where Are You?, 1970s television animation heavily consisted of shows that followed the Scooby-Doo format of teenagers and talking animals solving mysteries and hunting the paranormal. And the funny thing is, most of these shows were produced by Hanna-Barbera. Examples of these shows include The Funky Phantom, Josie and the Pussycats, The Amazing Chan and the Chan Clan, Speed Buggy, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kids, Goober and the Ghost Chasers, Inch High Private Eye, Clue Club, and Jabberjaw. It should also be worth mentioning that Hanna-Barbera was aware of how many Scooby-Doo-esque shows they churned out, and made a show in that same decade called Scooby's All-Star Laugh Olympics. And there was a team on that show that consisted exclusively of people from Scooby-Doo and its knockoffs. The main reason for this change was the swift removal of all action programming from Saturday mornings, following pressure from parents' lobbying groups such as the Action for Children's Television, or ACT for short. As for Filmation, the banning of action cartoons forced them to adapt, since their 1960s lineup consisted almost exclusively of superhero cartoons. While they had success with Fat Albert, they also ended up making a lot of animated spin-offs of live-action sitcoms and movies. These included The Brady Kids, Lassie's Rescue Rangers, Mission Magic, which was a spin-off of The Brady Kids, which was already a spin-off of The Brady Bunch, My Favorite Martians, Star Trek the Animated Series, The New Adventures of Gilligan, and many animated adaptations of the Archie comics. The lobbying from the ACT also paved the way for educational shows like Schoolhouse Rock, Dr. Henry's Emergency Lessons for People, and The Wonderful Stories of Professor Kitzel. The 1970s also witnessed the creation of Dr. Seuss-themed primetime animated specials, following the success of 1966's adaptation of How the Grinch Stole Christmas. Some of these were based on Dr. Seuss books like The Cat in the Hat, Horton Hears a Who, and The Lorax. There were also Dr. Seuss specials that were entirely original, such as The Hoover Bloop Highway and Halloween is Grinch Night. While some of the changes in this decade which resulted in the dark age of American animation continued into next decade, the next decade also saw some changes as well. While the 1980s had the movie Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which was basically an homage to classical theatrical animation, a lot of the dark era changes from the 70s continued into this decade. But there were also some new changes from this decade that should be worth mentioning. One noticeable change that happened during this decade is that Hanna-Barbera started to lose their grip in the television animation market. One factor behind this was the rise of a new animation studio named Deke Animation, and shows made by them which include Inspector Gadget, The Littles, Heathcliff and the Cadillac Cats, Dennis the Menace, and many others. Another reason why Hanna-Barbera started to lose their grip in the television animation market was due to the rise of a new type of animated show, with that new type being toy commercial cartoons. What these were is that they were cartoons that were made for the sole purpose of promoting a toy lineup, with examples of these toy commercial cartoons including the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, G.I. Joe, Transformers, My Little Pony, He-Man, She-Ra, Thundercats, and Care Bears. None of which Hanna-Barbera had any creative involvement in. The reason why toy commercial cartoons were big during this decade was due to the removal of programming and advertising regulations under former President Ronald Reagan. The said removal of regulations could also explain why some of these toy commercial cartoons featured action and violence, two types of things that were previously banned in the 1960s. The rise of video games led to the creation of video game-based cartoons such as Pac-Man, which was produced by Hanna-Barbera, Saturday Supercade, the Super Mario Bros. Super Show, and Captain N, the Game Master. As for animated adaptations of live-action movies and TV shows, that category stuck around for this decade, with shows including Fonz and the Happy Days Gang, which is another Scooby-Doo clone made by Hanna-Barbera, Filmation's Ghostbusters, The Real Ghostbusters. Yeah, the 80s had two Ghostbusters cartoons for some reason. The Dukes, Laverne and Shirley in the Army, Hulk Hogan's Rockin' Wrestling, Alf the Animated Series. There were even cartoons based on Beetlejuice and The Karate Kid. While Hanna-Barbera had the Smurfs and Snorks in this decade, those were really their only major successes from the 80s, and mostly just relied on rehashing old IPs like Scooby-Doo and the Flintstones. Meanwhile, Filmation ended up going out of business at the end of this decade. As for Disney, they finally make the jump into television animation at the end of this decade, with shows like DuckTales, Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers, and The New Adventures of Winnie the Pooh. Primetime animation also started to make a comeback in this decade with 1989's The Simpsons, which is to this day the longest running animated series in the history of American animation. From the looks of it, it seems that television animation underwent a lot of major changes at the end of the 80s. I'm sure most 90s kids have very fond memories of cartoons, and I don't blame them, since the time period from the late 80s to the mid-2000s is frequently referred to as the Renaissance age of American animation. On the theatrical side, the 90s made way for the Disney Renaissance, where Disney ended up making hit after hit, which started with 1989's The Little Mermaid and continued into this decade with films like Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, The Lion King, and Hercules. The 90s also saw CGI animation be used professionally, with 1995's Toy Story being the first animated film to be made entirely with computer graphics, and forever changed the landscape of theatrical animation. Now going back to the television side, it was also during this decade that the children's television network, Nickelodeon, decided to look for creator-driven content. The reason for this stems from a quote from Nickelodeon's president at the time, Geraldine Laybourne. Everybody else was doing toy-driven stuff, and it was garbage. It's hard to create a character out of a toy for a lot of reasons. You have limited time to produce because you have to get the thing out when the product hits the market. How about instead, we do this radical thing of looking around the country for animators who have great characters living inside them. Laybourne approached her fellow executive, Vanessa Coffey, to find artists in Los Angeles interested in pitching original cartoons. As Coffey accepted pitches, she decided that she did not want a consistent look like Disney specifically, searching for projects that had completely different styles from each other. Laybourne would eventually narrow the pool down to 3 pilots to expand into full shows. And as you would guess, those 3 shows ended up being Doug, Rugrats, and The Ren and Stimpy Show, with all 3 premiering in August of 1991. Coffey's strategy of not wanting consistent looks paid off here, as all 3 of these shows were unique in both art style and premise. Doug was a down-to-earth slice-of-life show that showcased the life of an average boy with a vivid imagination named Doug Funny as he navigated the predicaments in his everyday life that most kids would find relatable. Rugrats was a show about a bunch of babies encountering life experiences that were much greater in their imaginations. As for Ren and Stimpy, it took the zaniness of cartoons like Tom and Jerry and Looney Tunes and cranked that dial up to 11. Going to lengths of surrealism, slapstick, and psychotic moments that have never been seen or done before. All 3 of these shows ended up creating massive legacies and are still loved by many to this very day. A year later, Cartoon Network launched, with Hanna-Barbera's new division, Cartoon Network Studios, opening up 2 years later, with Hanna-Barbera's original studio and DiC going defunct in the next decade. The year after that, they launched the anthology series, What a Cartoon, which helped launch many Cartoon Network originals during this period, such as Dexter's Laboratory, Johnny Bravo, and the Powerpuff Girls. Disney continued to build upon their television presence with shows like Tailspin, Darkwing Duck, and Bonkers. A lot of Disney's animated movies also got cartoon shows such as The Little Mermaid, Aladdin, 101 Dalmatians, and The Lion King's Timon and Pumbaa. Even some of Disney's iconic characters were brought back into the animation spotlight with shows like Goof Troop, Quack Pack, and Mickey Mouse Works. While Saturday morning cartoons were in decline starting with this decade, famous filmmaker Steven Spielberg was an executive producer on some well-known ones, which include Tiny Toons, Animaniacs, Pinky and the Brain, and Freakazoid. The 90s also saw the rise in adult animation following the success of The Simpsons from the previous decade, and eliminating the decades-long stigma that cartoons are mainly for kids, with shows like Beavis and Butthead, Duckman, South Park, and King of the Hill. Meanwhile, DiC was still being DiC and continued making animated adaptations of games and movies with various levels of success. Even superhero cartoons started to make a comeback in this decade after having been banned since the 70s, with Warner Brothers producing shows like Superman the Animated Series and the new Batman Adventures. Going back to the first 3 Nicktoons, not only were they critically acclaimed, but I believe that they shaped this decade for children's television animation. Why I believe this is because most creator-driven kids shows from this decade either followed the Doug format or the Ren and Stimpy format. Examples of shows that followed the Doug format and were also down-to-earth slice-of-life shows with stories that kids can find relatable include Hey Arnold, Recess, and Pepper Ann. while shows that followed the Ren and Stimpy format include Rocko's Modern Life, The Angry Beavers, Cat Dog, Cow and Chicken, and I Am Weasel. Which is something that I found to be very interesting because Doug and Ren and Stimpy are practically polar opposites of each other, yet those two shows and the shows that took inspiration from those two shows managed to coexist within the same decade. Guess that's just the magic of the 90s. The Renaissance age of American animation continued well into the turn of the new millennium, with Pixar creating more CGI masterpieces with movies like Finding Nemo, Monsters Incorporated, and The Incredibles. The 2000s also saw other animation studios adopt CGI animation to compete with Pixar, such as Blue Sky Studios with movies like Ice Age and Robots, and DreamWorks with movies like Shrek and Madagascar. The 2000s was also when the internet really started to blow up, and as always, whenever humanity reached a new breakthrough in technology, a new breakthrough in animation would soon follow. And this was no exception, as this was the decade where internet cartoons started to take off. Now heading back to the television side of it, there also came a new format for kid shows for television animation during this decade, with that new format being Life of an Average Kid with a Twist. What I mean by this is that there are a lot of kid shows within this decade that followed what would be the life of an average kid, but there is some surreal element thrown in there to give it a more unique identity, rather than just having it become a generic slice of life show. Examples of these surreal elements include, but are not limited to, having fairy godparents who grant the kid wishes to make what would have been their miserable lives a lot more tolerable. Or having a magical piece of chalk that transports the kid into a whole new universe, where everything is a living chalk drawing. Or forcing the Grim Reaper to become subservient to a couple of kids. Or even giving a kid the supernatural ability to transform into a dragon. I could keep listing 2000s cartoons that follow this Life of an Average Kid with a Twist format, but we'd be here all day. And you kinda get the general idea. The revival of superhero cartoons in the late 90s continued into this decade as well, with Warner Brothers Animation making shows like Static Shock, Teen Titans, Justice League Unlimited, and Batman the Brave and the Bold. On top of that, Nickelodeon and Disney Channel also started making action shows during this decade with shows like Danny Phantom, Kim Possible, and My Life as a Teenage Robot. And much like in the 90s, the Saturday morning cartoon started to decline even more within this decade. So much so that Saturday morning network blocks had to adapt, and took the cheaper route by instead making anime dubs, rather than having to resort to create original content. While Warner Brothers, on top of the aforementioned superhero cartoons, also resorted to making reboots and revivals of old IPs like Scooby-Doo and Tom and Jerry. Now moving on to the adult animation side, not only did shows that premiere in 1999 gain traction in this decade with shows like Family Guy and Futurama, but Cartoon Network's night block, Adult Swim, also launched within this decade, and gave us shows like Aqua Teen Hunger Force, Robot Chicken, Squidbillies, and Home Movies. It should also be worth mentioning that the animation styles also started to diversify away from traditional cell animation in this decade, with one factor being the rise of animation software like Adobe Flash and Toonboom. Examples of shows that were mainly Flash animated were Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends, El Tigre, The Adventures of Manny Rivera, and Yin Yang Yo. The 2000s was also the first decade that saw CGI animation be implemented for television animation, with shows utilizing this being The Adventures of Jimmy Neutron Boy Genius, Back at the Barnyard, Handy Manny, and Mickey Mouse Clubhouse. There are also two shows from this decade that I haven't mentioned yet, and that's because they feel like they're in a league of their own and don't really fall into a category, with those two shows being SpongeBob SquarePants and Avatar: The Last Airbender. Sure, SpongeBob premiered in 1999, but only 11 half hours aired in that year, which was why I grouped it with the 2000s decade. And you could argue that Avatar: The Last Airbender is an action show, but I feel like there's so much more going for it in terms of story and writing, that it wouldn't even feel right categorizing it with the others. If there were two shows that I think stood out from the rest of the 2000s in terms of American animation, it would without a doubt be those two shows. Avatar: The Last Airbender for its amazing story, likable characters, eye-catching visuals, and stellar world building. and SpongeBob for its witty comedy, unique atmosphere, and memorable quotes that could be casually brought up into any conversation, and people would most likely get it. Honestly, the 2000s was such a unique decade for animation, and it's honestly very hard to generalize the whole decade, especially compared to other decades. And I'm sure people who grew up watching cartoons in the 2000s, such as myself, can agree that this was really a one-of-a-kind decade that will most likely never be replicated in the future. The 2010s was the decade where online video content really started to blow up in popularity, with video sharing sites like YouTube and Twitch becoming popular in this decade, but also the rise of streaming services like Netflix and Hulu. And after much thought, I believe that streaming services should count as television, since those shows are being made with TV-esque budgets. Going back on topic, as the saying goes, whenever humanity reaches a new breakthrough in technology, a new breakthrough in animation would soon follow. This also applies in this context as online animations, particularly the ones from YouTube and roosterteeth.com, where those websites saw a significant increase in internet animated shows, with the quality looking more professional than ever. For the main three children's networks of Nickelodeon, Cartoon Network, and Disney Channel, this rise in internet video content forced them to adapt, especially since browsing the internet was becoming significantly more popular among kids. Also, the fact that a fourth children's network, the Hub Network, joined a little too late and ended up going under within 5 years after launching. Meanwhile, the Saturday morning cartoon, which has been in a steady decline since the 90s, ended up dying off completely within this decade. Nickelodeon's strategy was to just keep making the same types of shows they usually made, where if it becomes successful, that's good, but if it isn't, we still have SpongeBob to bail us out. While Cartoon Network and Disney Channel took a different approach and tried to make animated shows for older audiences in mind, while still being kid-friendly. How they went about this was through either making stories and characters that older audiences would find more relatable, or give the show story arcs for the viewers to follow with each episode. Examples of these types of shows include Adventure Time, Regular Show, Gravity Falls, Steven Universe, and Star vs. the Forces of Evil. While this strategy by Cartoon Network and Disney Channel showed initial success, it was rather short-lived, as it turned out that the biggest shows during that time were shows that were actually made for kids in mind. And because of that, they started airing more of those shows instead. The type of animated shows that ended up adapting well to the popularity of internet media was adult animation. The 2010s also saw the rise of Bento Box Entertainment, an animation studio that focused primarily on adult animation, with one of their first shows, Bob's Burgers, also being their most successful show by far. After the success of Bob's Burgers, they've been pumping out adult animated shows left and right. And you could argue that Bento Box is basically the Hanna-Barbera / Filmation of adult animation. Despite that, there were still a lot of adult animated shows from this decade that weren't made by Bento Box, as Adult Swim had their big show of the decade with Rick and Morty. Adult animated shows have also been proven to be very successful on streaming services like Netflix, and the shows that helped contribute to its success were BoJack Horseman, F is for Family, Disenchantment, and Big Mouth, with the latter being successful for Netflix despite the feeling that it's universally disliked online. Adding onto the topic of streaming services, children's animated shows also made a splash on streaming services as well, though most of them were based on pre-existing IPs, with a good amount of them being made by DreamWorks and their respective IPs. Nonetheless, this decade proved to be an adjustment period for television, as it was finding new ways to adapt to the rise of internet video content. Now finally heading into the current decade, where much like the rest of Hollywood during this time, television animation is resorting to heavy usage of recycling old IPs rather than making something entirely new. We're only halfway through this decade and we've already gotten reboots of shows like Animaniacs, Futurama, Tiny Toons, Everybody Hates Chris, Rugrats, The Proud Family, Clone High, King of the Hill, and Phineas and Ferb. Not to mention that both SpongeBob and The Fairly OddParents got 2 spin-off shows so far within this decade. There have also been a lot of animated adaptations of graphic novels and other books like Cleopatra in Space, Harriet the Spy, Wandla, and Big Nate. Pixar and DreamWorks are also making TV shows based on their movies for streaming services with shows like Monsters at Work, Cars on the Road, Madagascar A Little Wild, Kung Fu Panda The Dragon Knight, and Megamind Rules. Sure, the 2020s had original shows, but the number of animated reboots, spin-offs, and adaptations are much higher than what it was used to be. In fact, most original animated TV shows in the 2020s were actually adult animated shows. Which is kind of funny for me because 50 years ago there was this established stigma that cartoons were mostly for children. Now adult animation is becoming more mainstream than children's animation today, thanks to channels like Fox and Adult Swim, along with streaming services like Netflix and Hulu. And it should also be worth mentioning that some of these adult animated shows were created by people who started making animations on YouTube. As for the big three children's television networks, let's just say they're not doing so well, since Nickelodeon is mainly dependent on merchandising of their IPs like SpongeBob and their acquired IPs like Garfield and the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. The Disney Channel has been pulled in many countries across the world, and let's just say Cartoon Network is dying a pretty slow and painful death, especially since Cartoon Network's main animation studio shut down in 2023. Their website got taken down recently and it now redirects to the streaming service Max. With the final nail in the coffin being that Cartoon Network will no longer be part of the basic cable package, which means it's going to be even less accessible than it has been before. And at this rate, it seems like these three main television networks are just only going to be mere products of a bygone era. If the first half of this decade was any indicator, then it seems like this decade is going to be the decade of reboots and spin-offs, with most of the originality going to adult animation. But before I end this really long video, I want to talk about how television animation might grow past the 2020s. Because I feel like one major obstacle that television animation faces in the future is the growth of internet animation not only in quantity, but also in quality. Since things like crowdfunding and online merch sales makes it so much easier for internet animation to get the funding it needs than it has been before. Another factor that could influence the growth of television animation in the future is the rise of AI. Because as mentioned earlier, whenever humanity reaches a new breakthrough in technology, a new breakthrough in animation would soon follow. While the recent Hollywood strikes occurred over the usage of AI, it was over the usage of AI in writing and digital performances of acting, rather than animation. If AI was utilized ethically, like making the animation process faster and cheaper to produce without sacrificing a lot of jobs or the overall quality of the animation, then all types of animation, not just television animation, could benefit from this. But the main concern about that is, there are so many ways that it can go wrong. But anyways, that's it. Sure, the video was longer than a lot of my other videos, and the topic is one that I typically don't talk about on my channel. I just thought it would be interesting to talk about how television animation has changed over the years, and what might be in store for it in the future. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.